Today is a presidential election in the United States. It is November 5th, 2024. And one of the things that occurred to me was, wouldn't it be interesting to ask both of the candidates getting either elected or failing to get elected today, if they know the U.S. presidents? And what I mean by that is, of course, they could name George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. Every time I go to buy one of those Boy Scout troop, hey, buy some popcorn or cookies from us, they always know George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. So I'm just curious, without any warning, if we just ask them, could you list off the presidents? Could you list them off in order? Can you tell me when they served? Can you tell me something that they did while they were president? Now, you can't know that I have nothing in front of me except my photographer, but I have nothing in front of me but my photographer. There's no note cards. There's no one of those little glasses that people read off of. I'm just going to go ahead and go. Now, the first time through, I think I'll just do the presidents and the dates that they served, meaning the years that they served. If I say a little tiny tidbit, I'll try to keep those to a minimum, because mostly I really think if I was running for president, that it's only reasonable that I know all the ones that came before me. Don't you think that's fair? I think that's fair. So, in 1789, we had a constitution that said we had an executive branch. And in 1789, George Washington, who had been a general in the American Revolution, became the first president. In 1789, he won by unanimous, so he didn't run against anyone. Got a unanimous vote. He went from 1789 and he served 2 terms, so 1797. Now, the great news for you is that all the way until 1840, we never lost a president, so it's a 4-year or an 8-year gig. And so George Washington was our first one. He's on Mount Rushmore, and he went from 1789 to 1797. The next president was John Adams, and John Adams served from 1797 to 1801. His vice president was the man he beat, which is Thomas Jefferson, and I oftentimes wonder how funny it would be if we had Trump as president with Hillary as vice president, and there's a lot of fun ones you can do. Would have been at least entertaining on the news cycle. So anyway, back to John Adams. He ended in 1801. In 1801 to 1809, we had Thomas Jefferson, served 2 terms, and he's on Mount Rushmore. And then in 1809 to 1817, we had James Madison. So we had George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Madison goes from 1809 to 1817. He was the president during the War of 1812, which lasted 2 years, by the way. It's not just in 1812. And then the next president was 1817 to 1825. That's James Monroe. And at this point, at this point in our presidencies, we've had John Adams, which was from Massachusetts, and all the other presidents were from Virginia. I just think that's an interesting tidbit. Then, in 1825, there was an election in 1824 that was very scandalous. And it went to the House of Representatives, and they voted and voted. And even though the person with the more electoral votes didn't win, even though that's a whole different story, so we just won't even go down that road about the Electoral College at the time. But John Quincy Adams, which was the son of John Adams from Massachusetts, won. So in our first 6 presidents, we have 2 Massachusetts and 4 Virginians. It's just interesting. So John Quincy Adams served 1 term from 1825 to 1829, and then from 1829 to 1837 is Andrew Jackson, and then Andrew Jackson, vice president, took over after that. So from 1837 to 1841, we had Martin Van Buren. Now, this is where things change, because in 1841 began the presidency of William Henry Harrison. And William Henry Harrison, at his inauguration, he gave the longest speech in inauguration history, and he didn't want to wear a coat or anything, so it was kind of cold. This was March, because back in the good old days, we used to have March as the time that a president changed office, not in January like now. And William Henry Harrison came to power in 1841 and died 30 days plus after he was president from pneumonia from the cold he got at the inauguration. So he was our first president to die in office. And it was like, whoa, what do we do? And how is this going to work? And we took the vice president, and his name was John Tyler, who really wasn't William Henry Harrison's anything more than his running mate. He really wasn't of the same party. In fact, the party that won in 1841 is called the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. And it was the first time that they'd won. And then here they are 30 plus days in, and he's gone, and John Tyler's in. So John Tyler finished that term. So he's 1841 to 1845. And it is in his presidency that the country of Texas joined the United States and became part of the United States. And then from 1845 to 1849, we had James K. Polk, and he was a very big deal in the expansion of America because he is the one who won he was president during the Mexican-American War, and we got California and some other states out west. 1849 to 1850, we had Zachary Taylor, another Whig, but he died just right into his presidency, 1850. And so from 1850 to 1853, we have his vice president was a guy named Millard Fillmore, not one of your more famous, well-known presidents. Then from 1853 to 1857, we had Franklin Pierce, I think the only president from New Hampshire. And then 1857 to 1861, we had James Buchanan, the only bachelor president in history, U.S. history. And James Buchanan was the president that kind of let the South secede and didn't really make a big fuss. And even though he was from Pennsylvania, he had quite a big fondness for the South. So he didn't really do much. And so Abraham Lincoln then came to power, and he's a Republican, the first Republican president. And he was president from 1861 to 1865. Now, that's a little deceiving because 1861 to 1865 is his term. But he won re-election. During the Civil War, we had an election in 1864. The South wasn't allowed to vote, so little different outcome maybe if the South had been allowed. And Abraham Lincoln won a second term, became president for the second term in March of 1865, and then was assassinated in April of 1865. So his vice president would finish his term, and that's Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson never won, he didn't win the election of 1869 or necessarily even try for it. He was not a very popular president. So he served from 1865 April to the end of the term in 1869. Then we voted for Ulysses S. Grant, who is the guy on our $50 bill. By the way, without really obvious, Abraham Lincoln's another head on Mount Rushmore. That's 3 of them done. And then we'll get to the last one in a minute. So Ulysses S. Grant, which was the general of the Union that kind of won the war and beat Robert E. Lee, and defeated Robert E. Lee's army, he served from 1869 to 1877, so for 2 terms. And then in 1877 to 1881, we had Rutherford B. Hayes. Not a real famous one either, but he was there. He also won an election in which the electoral vote was just different by 1. And there were, as a commission that picked him because they said all the disputed electoral votes go to him. And so Samuel Tilden, the guy he beat, was only 1 electoral vote from winning. And then this commission came together to say what to do with these last electoral votes that were in dispute. And they awarded all of them to Rutherford B. Hayes. So he won by 1 electoral vote. That's the only time that's ever happened. Rutherford B. Hayes then went to 1881, and then in 1881, or 1880, the election of 1880, was kind of a fun one because Ulysses S. Grant had gone to Europe after he was president, came back, thought, well, I'll run again, what the heck. Then William Tecumseh Sherman's brother, I think John Sherman of Ohio, ran, and they wanted the Republican nomination, and everyone knew for the most part that Republicans were going to win, because ever since Abraham Lincoln there had never been anything but a Republican president, because the Republicans were pro-union and all the Democrats were those people who had been pro-Southern, supposedly. Anyway, in 1880 election, in the nominating process, neither Grant nor Sherman could win. And so they actually picked a guy from Ohio that wasn't there to be president. Like, he wasn't going to run for president. They asked him to run. They picked him. They said, please run. And he ran and he won. And his name's James Garfield. James Garfield then is president in 1881. But only in 1881 because he's the second president that's assassinated. He was shot in the back by a job seeker, an office seeker, and he had actually visited with Garfield in person, because you could actually go to the White House, sit and wait for the president, and you could have a visit with the president. Pretty amazing how life has changed. But in 1881, this guy named Charles Guiteau shot him in the back. Sadly, truly sadly for James Garfield, it would have been better if he'd have just died immediately, because instead what happened was they tried to get the bullet out with the guy that was with him, his finger, and then when they took him to the doctor, they used knives and things that were not clean, and so he got a bacterial infection and got blood poisoning, and he died of that months later, like 4+ months later, he died. Lost all his weight. I mean, it was just horrid. It was horrid what happened to James Garfield. And so he died in 1881, same year that he became president. I think it was September, if my memory serves. And then his Chester Arthur then became president. And he was president from 1881 to 1885. So he finished the term of the assassinated president, but then again, he didn't win after that. So Chester Arthur was president until 1885. And then in 1885 to 1889, we have Grover Cleveland. He won the electoral vote and the popular vote. Then in 1889 to 1893, we have Benjamin Harrison, who won the electoral vote, but not the popular vote. Grover Cleveland actually won the popular vote, but didn't get to be president again. And then on the third time around, 1892 election, 1893, Grover Cleveland comes back because he won the popular vote 3 times, but the electoral vote only the 2 opposite, the outside times. So he's the only president in U.S. history with 2 non-consecutive terms. That may or may not change today, as today is election day in the United States, November of 2024. So I'm to Grover Cleveland's last term, which was 1893 to 1897. And then we had William McKinley, which was 1897 to 1901, and he was assassinated after his second election. So he won re-election and then was assassinated by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, shot him in the stomach at a expedition that was in exhibition in Buffalo, New York. And ironically, one of the reasons William McKinley died was they couldn't get the bullet out. But at the actual exhibition he was at in Buffalo, they had the first X-ray machine on exhibition, and they didn't use it to find the bullet on William McKinley, and so he died. But his vice president, which was a different guy than his first term, was Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. He would then get reelected in 1904, become president from 1905, 1909, and so he was president from 1901 to 1909, and he's the 4th head on Mount Rushmore. And then he said, hey, I want Taft to be my man after, and so Taft became the president, and William Howard Taft was president from 1909 to 1913. He is the only president that became the Supreme Court Chief Justice, which that's kind of just an interesting tidbit. He's also the heaviest president we've ever had, and according to some folklore out there, he got stuck in his bathtub and it fell through the floor of the White House and crashed. But Again, there's no film at 7 because we didn't have things like cell phones to go, oh, look what I just saw. So William Howard Taft went till 1913. And then a funny thing happened. In 1912, the election of 1912, Teddy Roosevelt had been in Africa doing safari hunting and things and collecting things for the Smithsonian Institute. And he came back and said, Taft, you haven't done my job as well as I did, so I want to run again. And the Republican Party, this is kind of shattering, really, when you think about it compared to the Republican Party today. The Republican Party said, Taft is our man. So Teddy Roosevelt broke away from the Republican Party and started what's oftentimes called the Bull Moose Party, or the Progressive Party. And Teddy Roosevelt and Taft ran, both of them, for that office against a man named Woodrow Wilson. If they had not been so egocentric, and one of them had run, their combined votes beat Woodrow Wilson, but because they split the Republican vote, Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913, and he'd serve all the way till 1921. He was the president, and this is a fun, easy thing to remember. He's W.W., Woodrow Wilson, even though that's not his real first name. His first name was Thomas. Woodrow Wilson is the president during World War I, so W.W. and W.W.1. Woodrow Wilson is president until 1921. The president that comes in next, who was elected in 1920, is Warren G. Harding. And although I'm going to do a different video on this, Warren Harding had a 1-year-old illegitimate child from his mistress while he was running for president. Didn't mention that to the Republican guys that said, let's have you be our president. And Warren Harding also invented a word. There was never a word called normalcy before he was president, but he wanted to return to normalcy. And we've had that word in our vocabulary ever since, but it wasn't a real word. Anyway, he was president from 1921 to 1923. He did not even finish his term, and he died while in office. And it's interesting to note, even though I don't want to go down this road long, his wife found the letters between he and his mistress, burnt them, so we don't have them, but also found out about the mistress and cut her off. Warren Harding had been giving her money because he had a child by her, the only child he ever had. And he was supporting them secretly. But when his wife found out all about it, and with Warren Harding dead, she cut the money off. And so this lady, Nan Britton is her name, she published a book called The President's Daughter, and it's sort of a kiss and tell kind of a book. And she talked about the affair that they had and how they had supposedly had a little tryst in a closet in the White House one time. Anyway, Warren Harding's gone in 1923, and so his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, comes in. Calvin Coolidge will then win re-election in 1924 and serve until 1929. He is going to be president from 23 to 29, Calvin Coolidge, and those are the years of the stock market boom. And then in 29, the guy who took over is Herbert Hoover, which was a self-made millionaire, and everybody in America thought, well, self-made millionaire, he must be a good businessman, so everything will be fantastic. And then it was in September and October of 1929 that the great crash happened, and stock market crash and the Great Depression happened. And so Herbert Hoover only served one term. That's from 1929 to 1933. And then Franklin Roosevelt serves from 1933 all the way to 1945. So he served 12 years, but he won 4 elections. They've done an amendment, amendment number 22, that says you can't do that anymore. So even if Trump wins today, he can't be president again. You can't have more than 2 terms as president, not even non-consecutive, consecutive or otherwise. You just can be president twice, and that's the end. So anyway, when Franklin Roosevelt ran, he ran 4 different times, and he had different vice presidents some of those times. And the last vice president he picked, just in November of 1944, was Harry Truman. And so Franklin Roosevelt died in April of 1945, just a month after his inauguration, just like Abraham Lincoln died a month after his inauguration back in 1865. And anyway, Truman would come in, win election on his own, which was a very tight race, in 1948. And then he'd serve all the way until 1953. So from 1945 to 1953, the beginning of the Korean War happened during Truman's time. The president that came next was neither a Republican or a Democrat formally until right around 1952, when he decided to be Republican after all. His name was Dwight Eisenhower, and he served from 53 to 61. His vice president, ironically, was a guy named Richard Nixon, which is more famous later. Then in 1961, Nixon ran in 1960 against John F. Kennedy, did not win, but it was super, super close, one of the closest elections in U.S. history. And Kennedy became president, and then he served from 1961 to 1963. As well as most of you know, he was our fourth president assassinated. So we had Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, and then John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. And then his vice president took over, and his name is Lyndon Baines Johnson. He then won the election in 1964, so he would serve until 1969. But he shocked the world in 1968 election when he said he wouldn't run again, even though he could legally have done that because he had only served a little bit of John F. Kennedy's second term. The rest of his first term, and then he ran on his own and ran 4 years, and then he said, no, I'm not going to go again. So he left in 1869, and the election of 1968 would have Nixon again try it, but this time he would have had to run against another Kennedy because Robert Kennedy was running for president. But in June of 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And so the vice president under Lyndon Johnson, a guy named Hubert Humphrey, ran, and Nixon was able to beat him again. A very, very close election in 1968. So Nixon would come in 1969. He would serve one term, but at the end of his first term, he decided to do some fun things called Watergate, which is another video altogether, so I'm not going to do it right here. And he is the only U.S. president in history to resign. So he left in 1974. So he would have gone from 1969 to 1977. But because of the scandal of Watergate, he left in 1974. His vice president, who he picked, because his first vice president had been kicked out of office before him, another scandal, another fun video later, and his name was Spiro Agnew, by the way. So actually, Nixon picked his vice president named Gerald Ford, and then resigned, and then Gerald Ford became president from 1974, which is the only one that's really kind of tricky there, date-wise, to 1977. And Gerald Ford pardoned Mr. Nixon, which is why he didn't serve any time for the things that he was guilty of in regards to Watergate and the Watergate scandal and the cover-up. So then he went until 1977. And in the election of 1976, a guy named Ronald Reagan ran against Gerald Ford to see who'd be Republican. Gerald Ford barely squeaked that out. And then Gerald Ford just lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976. And so in 1977 to 1981, you have James Earl Carter, or Jimmy Carter. He only served one term. Then in 1981 to 1989, you have Ronald Reagan, who served 2 full terms. Then in 1989 to 1993, you had George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush. And then from 1993 to 2001, you had Mr. Clinton, Bill Clinton. And then in 2001 to 2009, you had George W. Bush, which is George Herbert Walker Bush's son. So we've had 2 of those now. We've had John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And then we had George Herbert Walker Bush, and then George W. Bush as a father and son. And George Bush II served 2 terms, so he was president until 2009. Then we had a bit of a surprise in the world because of the Great Recession and all the other chaos that was going on. Barack Obama became president from 2009 and served till 2017. Trump then won the election of 2016, even though the popular vote, which has never been as wide, Over 2.5 million people more voted for Hillary than for Donald, but the electoral vote squeaked by for Mr. Trump, and so he became president from 2017 to 2021. He did not win re-election, news to some. He did not win re-election in 2020, so Biden became president from 2021 to 2025 is when he'll leave office. And in 2024 election, Donald Trump is running as a Republican, and Kamala Harris is running as the Democrat. And today is the election day that determines which of them wins, and we'll see how that works out. We don't know as I'm making this video. I will say I've done several videos on the Electoral College, and I hope that you'll look at some of those. I've done lots and lots of videos now, so I hope you'll just find the channel and kind of browse around and see what kind of interests you. I have a whole series called What's in a Name, so that you can find out why we have why we call grandfather clocks, why we call honeymoon, honeymoons, why we call the Yucatan Peninsula. I have some timeline ones about why we use BC and AD and how that whole structure of timing and dating worked. So anyway, I know you may not believe me, but I had no papers, nothing at all to look at, and I don't believe I made a single mistake on the presidents and the dates. If I did, I certainly probably just said something wrong, because I certainly know all of them. What I try to do for the Boy Scouts is every time I see a Boy Scout at a table selling popcorn, I just give them $5 for every president they can name. Imagine my surprise someday when I bump into me as a boy and I know all the presidents, so I'm going to give away a lot of money to the Boy Scouts. But I typically don't have to give any more than about $20, $25 away. And I don't take any popcorn, so it's nice enough that I do that for them. But I just find it funny how many people know George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and then like Trump or Obama, and that's about where they end. It's kind of interesting. Again, I think it would be so fun if we would just say to Mr. Trump with no warning, can you do it? Say to Miss Harris, can you do it? Mrs. Harris, Miss Harris, I guess. Can you do it? And see how well they do. I think it'd be super eye-opening, because most of us do not know most of all of our presidents, and certainly don't know their dates of office. And I could go through each of them and say something that happened every term as well, but we're not going to gloat or brag right now. I just promise I can do that. And then I am going to do a couple of narrowed down presidents where I just do a couple of tidbits about them. Thanks for your time.